Hi guys, welcome back. I'm Craig and I'm a software developer in the UK, and in this video we're going to build upon the work that we did with divs and spans by learning all about classes and IDs. We'll be learning what these are, how we apply them to elements, and also how we can use them to target elements that we'll then do something with using, say, CSS or JavaScript. We'll have a bit of exposure to CSS in this video, and we have our 40 or so CSS videos coming up when we've covered the HTML. So there's 3 more HTML videos to come after this one, and then we're on to the CSS. I'm not expecting you to get the CSS down right now, but I wanted to start slowly introducing you to it a little at a time to show you that it's not difficult at all to pick up, so you'll see some in action, and hopefully this early exposure will be beneficial when we're ready to move on to CSS fully. We're on all of the main social media platforms, as everybody is these days, so if you'd like to join us on Twitter, Instagram or Facebook, then we'd be happy to see you there, and the links for all of those are in the description below. If you're finding the content useful on the channel, please remember to smash the like button and subscribe. We're posting a couple of videos a week, so remember to click the bell and get notified when those videos drop. The more engagement that the channel gets, then the more YouTube's algorithm will get hold of the content and put it in front of people that can benefit from it. Okay, so I'll start by talking about CSS syntax. We saw the CSS element selector in the divs and spans video, and this is simply the name of the element and then the styles that we want inside of curly braces. So here, every single div will be styled like so: red border and text, pinkish background, and a margin to create some space around each div. Every span will take on these styles, which are similar to the div, but everything is in blue and we have text in bold. A class selector looks similar to the element selector, but it is a name. Any name that we choose is totally up to us what we call our classes, and these are preceded by a full stop or period. An ID selector is a name of our choosing, preceded by a hash symbol, and here's a comparison of the 3. At the bottom is our element selector, and here we're choosing the P or paragraph element. Then the styles are inside the curly braces. For the classes, we have a name that we choose, preceded by a period or full stop, and for an ID it is preceded by a hash or octothorpe symbol. I don't want you to worry too much about CSS syntax, however, as we'll cover selectors in depth shortly in the upcoming CSS videos, but I wanted to show you so that you know that periods represent classes and hash symbols or octothorpes represent IDs. So we're interested in this bit and this bit, the name and a hash or dot in front of it. We can use this syntax with Emmet in our HTML files to quickly write elements with classes and IDs attached. So I'm going to go over and highlight and copy the CSS. The link to this is below in the description if you want to do the same, and I'm going to paste it into my own CSS file that I have open here and save. I just have an empty CSS file and an HTML file with a boilerplate built out using Emmet shortcut of hitting the exclamation mark and hitting tab. We'll go to the HTML, and if I put P plus P in the body, by now we will know what will happen. Emmet gives us this abbreviation window that indicates that as things stand, we're going to create 2 sibling paragraph elements. And if I change to p.green plus p, using the CSS syntax for a class, we see in the window here that the first p element now has a class attribute. And if I put p.green plus p hash bold, the second p now has an ID attribute. If we hit tab, Emmet makes 2 paragraphs, one with the class of green applied and one with the ID of bold. We'll also give each paragraph 10 words of lorem ipsum, and there we go. We've got 2 paragraphs that are simply styled, one with a class and one with an ID. So once Emmet makes the elements in HTML, we see that the syntax for classes and IDs is different. Classes and IDs are simply denoted in HTML by keywords, and they go in the opening tags of the elements that they are applied to. This should be familiar by now, as this is just like all of the other attributes that we've been learning about. Classes and IDs have the same syntax of a keyword, then an equal sign, and then the value goes in the double quotes. In this case, the value of green for the class or bold for the ID means that any styles associated with green or bold would be applied to these particular elements respectively. In our case, our green class is just making the text green, and our bold ID is making the text in that paragraph bold. So from this brief example that we've seen, we can begin to say that classes and IDs are a way for us to target specific HTML elements so that we can do something with them, like apply styles. We can also use IDs and classes to target HTML elements with JavaScript, and we'll look at some simple examples in a bit. IDs and classes do have differences. An ID is used to identify one element uniquely, so an ID can only be used one time in an HTML file. This can be on a div or a paragraph or whatever you like, but you must use it only once to identify an element uniquely. A class, on the other hand, can be used on multiple elements wherever you want throughout a page, and you can use a class 100,000 times if you really wanted, though that would of course not be particularly practical. In the last lecture, we applied some styles to divs and spans by selecting the elements directly. This approach is perfectly fine and will work in some cases, but it wouldn't necessarily always meet our needs, as here we are selecting and styling every single div or every single span on the page. Perhaps we only want to style specific divs or specific spans or other elements, and this is where classes and IDs really come into force. They help us to target only the element or elements that have the given class or ID. So I'm going to work in this same file that we had at the end of the last video, and if you want to code along, the link to this is in the description below. You can either grab it from the GitHub repo or work within this code pen that I'm using here. It's totally up to you. If you work in the code pen, make sure that you click this button to fork it so you can save your changes. Also, I'm going to begin writing the classes and IDs manually for the remainder of this video rather than using Emmet shortcuts, and I suggest that you do this as well, just so that you can get used to the syntax. So inside my first div here, I'm going to say that we have an attribute called class, which is equal to double quotes. Inside the double quotes, we give some kind of value. In this case, the class name. I'll give it the value of list, as this is descriptive of what we have here. Where possible, it's good practice to have class and ID names that describe what they are doing or what they are being used for. So I'm going to use this list class to make a huge series of changes to how the list in this div appears. I don't expect you to follow along with the CSS, as I know I haven't taught that yet, but the CSS is a teaching tool that will help me demonstrate classes and IDs. So in the CSS, this will be .list and some curly braces. The curly braces create a block, and everything that we put inside this block will be applied to the list class. So I'll have a border of none and save, and we see that that removes the red border. I'll make the color of the text content white, and I'll give it a dark grey background color, say #333. And this is a hexadecimal color code, and we'll have a series of lectures on color in CSS, and that will go over the various ways that we can add color to our pages. Then we'll give some space in our navbar by adding some padding. Though the previous div styles are still being applied to all of the divs on the page, including the div that the list class is applied to, they are now being overridden by the styles that we've just added. And this is due to a CSS rule called specificity. And we will talk about this fully in the upcoming CSS section of videos, but very briefly, class selectors are more specific than element selectors in CSS. So when an element has styles applied to it from more than one selector, styles that come from a class will take precedence over the styles that are applied directly to elements. There are of course styles which will take precedence over class selectors, and if you want to dive into some more information on specificity right now, then head over to this link at CSS Tricks, which really does explain the concept quite beautifully. I won't spend too long on this right now, But I will draw attention to this image, which gives us a really simplified visual illustration to specificity in CSS. We see that styles that are applied directly to elements are the least specific, and the most specific is the style attribute, or we would call this inline styles that are applied directly in the opening tag of HTML elements. There is actually a higher specificity than this, and the highest comes from the important declaration, which overrides everything else. And we can see this here on MDN. It says that when an important rule is used on a style declaration, this declaration overrides any other declarations. However, it is bad practice and should be avoided because it makes debugging more difficult by breaking the natural cascading in your style sheets. But okay, back to the code. Next, I want to target the list inside the div, and for that we would use a descendant combinator of list UL. And this is saying target any UL element that is a descendant of an element with the class of list. And we do this as we have another UL on the page in the our product section. And that UL is not a descendant of an element with the class of list at the moment, so will be unaffected by the styles that we add in this selector. So if we just said UL by itself here, then it would be affected. So for these styles, we'll use some flexbox to lay out the list, and flexbox was designed to help us with layout, space distribution between items, and also to give us better alignment capabilities. Again, we'll cover flexbox in some depth during the CSS section of videos, and we'll build some pretty cool projects with it. For now, as we're just focusing on HTML, I will refrain from explaining it, and I'll just go ahead and get to work. We'll set the UL element to be a flex container using the display flex property, and we'll justify the content to the end of the flex container. Next, we'll target the actual list items, and first we'll take away these bullet points that are given to us by default, and we do that using list style none. Then we'll space them out a little using some padding. Okay, so we're beginning to get there. Hopefully you're beginning to get an idea of the workflow that we use in CSS, where we burrow down into elements and we use the specificity concept to target an element's children. The very last thing we need to do is to have something happen when we hover over one of the list items, which is fairly typical in navigation items or clickable elements on the page. We need to give some indication to our users that a given element is interactive. So for this, I'll use the hover pseudo class, which again, I'll explain during the CSS videos, but briefly we would use a pseudo class to define a special state of an element. So when something is being hovered, or when a link has been clicked on, etc., etc. So we'll have list li:hover, and here we're saying for any li element that is a descendant of an element with the class of list, when it is hovered over, do whatever is in this block, or what is inside these curly braces. So in this case, I'll say that on hover, change the text color to yellow and make the cursor a pointer rather than an arrow. Okay, so if we try that, we see those changes in action, and that's looking a lot better. And remember that we have achieved these wholesale changes by applying just one class that's applied to the div that contains the UL. We can use classes as many times as we like on the page, so let's use the list class again. If we pop down to where the HTML is for our product section, let's add it to the div that's wrapping everything. So we'll have class equals list, and we save, and we automatically have this huge style transformation from a single class attribute being added. If you've heard of Bootstrap before, which is a UI framework, then what we've just done is basically a simplified version of the concept behind how Bootstrap works. Bootstrap is essentially a huge style sheet and a huge JavaScript file that you add a link to in your HTML file, just like you would add a link to your style sheet. Bootstrap is a huge amount of styles that are pre-written for us, and what you need to do is just add the class names to these styles inside your HTML elements. and those styles are automatically applied. And you can find a list of all of the classes associated with Bootstrap here at this link at W3 Schools. Once you add one or more of these classes, you will see an instant stylistic change, as we did when we added the .list class to our product section. And we see that one class name results in a huge change in style. And now we have two div elements that point to the same class name in the CSS file. In addition to using a single class across multiple elements, we can also use more than one class on a single element. Class names are separated by a space when we do this, and we just add the class attribute keyword once, and all class names inside the quotation marks are separated from existing classes by a space. So in the Our Product section, I'm going to add a second class of green text, making sure it is separated from the list class by a space. Then I'll head over to the CSS and add .green -text, and I'll give it the color of spring green. Now we see that this second class has added that color to the text of the element that it is applied to. We don't have to just apply our classes to divs like I have been and then style everything within them as we've done so far. Different types of elements can share a class, so we'll give the first list item in the top div the class of green-text also. And we see that the list item takes on that style and all of the other list items remain exactly as they were. So you can apply a class to whatever HTML you like, and classes can be used simultaneously as many times as you like on the page on whatever combination of elements that you want them applied to. Also, as I said earlier, we can also use classes to target elements for use with JavaScript, and I'll give you a very quick and simple example. The goal isn't to understand the CSS or JavaScript that I'm writing, so I'm not trying to explain them too deeply. I'm just trying to give a good demonstration of the use of classes and IDs in the real world. So when you see them in markup, you'll know exactly why they're there, or you'll have some idea why they're there. So I'll give our only h1 a class of main-heading, and I can make use of this with JavaScript. I will show you a simple example of triggering an alert pop-up when we click on the heading. So I'll select the main heading class that we applied to the h1. Then once we've done that, we will add an event listener, which is listening for some event to happen on the page, a click, or when a mouse passes over an element, for example, and we'll say that we're going to listen for a click. And on click, we will call a function which is going to alert something, and we will alert you clicked the heading. Now if we save, we can head over to the h1 and click, and we see, just as we expected, that we can trigger the alert. We could do obviously way more than this with JavaScript, and we will do in good time. We could use this same technique to click through a carousel of images, or click a button to show particular items on the page and hide others. We could hover an image to show a larger version, or click an internal link to trigger a scroll to another section of the page, and so on. Again, the goal isn't to explain the JavaScript, we're just demonstrating the use of the class. What I'm trying to highlight throughout, which I hope that you're getting, is that we have a class in our HTML, we targeted the element that the class is applied to, and then we're doing something with it. We can have more than one class on an element and multiple instances of the same class through the web page. IDs do differ from classes, but can have similar applications as well. I'll add an ID to the top div, so we'll add the ID keyword, an equal sign, and then the quotation marks, and we will call this ID top. Next, I'm going to go to the CSS, and if we remember, IDs are denoted by a hash symbol or octothorpe. So we'll say hash top, the curly braces, and then we will add styles inside these. For now, we'll just add a border, and this is going to be 3 pixels, solid, and spring green again. Next, I'm going to place all of our content inside an outer container. So that will enable us to control the width of the page as well as the alignment. So I'm going to highlight all of the content in our body section and cut it. I'll create a div with the ID of outer-container, and for this we can use the Emmet shortcut of hash outer-container. And Emmet is automatically going to assume that this is being applied to a div if we don't specify the element. For other elements, you would add the element's name in front of the ID. If we hit tab now, Emmet creates the div for us, and then we will just paste everything that we cut out inside of this. Now I'll go to the CSS and I'll add our ID selector for the outer container. And inside the curly braces, we will set the width of the container and therefore all of the content inside to 80%. So this is going to take up 80% of the page width. And we will align it centrally using the margin 0 auto trick. So just like we've seen with classes, we can style elements using IDs. We've styled 2 different divs in very different ways using IDs. When we talked about classes, we discovered that we could use the same class multiple times across the page. And though we have said this, I will remind you, just to keep hammering it home, that we can't do that with IDs, as these are unique identifiers. The IDs that we've used here, the ones that we've applied, are actually defining unique characteristics of our page here. Namely, we've defined the outer container that all of our content is in. There can, of course, only be one outer container. And secondly, we're defining the top of the page, and there can only be one top of the page. So that's really the main difference to hone in on between classes and IDs. There are reasons that we want our IDs to be unique and only occur once, and one reason is navigation within a page. We can use this top ID that we've created to navigate to the top of the page. You will have seen those buttons on websites, I'm sure, that say something like go back to the top. Well, these are done using internal links which make use of IDs, and I'll show you how. So if we go to the bottom of the page and create an A element, and in the href we just reference that ID using hash top. We'll give it some text content that we can click on. Now we save and go to the bottom of the page and we see our internal link here. We could of course style this to look like a button of some sort, but I'll leave that for now as we're just looking at the functionality. So we have the href set to the ID of top, and that ID references the top div, which is the navigation. So if we click our link, it takes us to the top of the page. I won't do all of these navigation links, but I will demonstrate this once more. We'll add an href of contact here, and in the contact section, we'll add the ID of contact to the div that is wrapping the form. Now, if we test that, we have 2 working internal links that we've made using IDs, and it's this behavior which makes it clear to us why we need our IDs to be unique. Once we've added an internal link using an ID as an href, then the browser needs to know where to relocate to on the page. If there's more than one ID of that name, then of course the browser won't know what to do. We've looked at these internal links previously, and we even added some JavaScript to give us some nice smooth scrolling. So if you haven't seen that video and want to find out some more about this, check that out in the link that's appearing on the screen now, or use the link that I'll provide below in the description. I have this GitHub gist that contains the code to give us the smooth scrolling, and I'll add this in the description too. So I'll take this code and I'll pop it into our JavaScript with a comment to say scrolling, just so you know what it is. And now when we click our links that we see, we have this nice scrolling effect. Again, we can use IDs with JavaScript in a similar way to how we did with classes. We can grab hold of IDs using the getElementsById method. So to speed things up, I'll copy what we did to trigger the alert for the click on the heading, and I'll make some small modifications. So we have a variable of contact, and then this time we will get elements by ID. And what we're going to get is the ID of contact. Then we're going to add an event listener to contact. And this time, instead of triggering an alert, I'll get rid of that. What we'll do this time is change the color of the background of the div that the contact form is in once it is clicked. So we'll change it to our lovely spring green color, I think. So we'll put contact.style.background color equals spring green. So we've selected the element with the ID of contact, saved it to a variable. We're then adding an event listener to that variable to listen for a click. When there is a click, we're saying change the color of the background to spring green. So let's test it out, and we see that it works quite nicely. And fairly simply, that's how we grab an ID with JavaScript. We've seen how we do it with the CSS ID selector, and we know that we need them to be unique, occurring once on the page for identification purposes, for things like internal linking and for labels to be bound to form inputs, etc. We've used IDs with forms in a previous video, so if you want to know how we bind labels and form inputs, check that video out, as I'm not going to demonstrate that here in this video as we've done it before. I'll put that in the description below, and if you don't want to click the description, it's in the card that is popping up on the screen now. Okay, so that has been classes and IDs, and I hope you now have a deep and detailed understanding of why and how they're used in front-end web development. They really allow us to marry together the three core front-end languages. We can target specific HTML elements so that we can do something with them, like apply styles or use JavaScript. We can have more than one class on an element and multiple instances of that same class throughout our web page. IDs are unique on the page and must not be repeated. We can use IDs for the purposes of internal linking and binding labels to form inputs, but we can also use them as well to style elements, just like we do with classes. Okay, so we'll leave things there. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, comment, share, and all of that good stuff. And reach out to me on social media or email if you have any questions. The details are in the description below. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.